Is the tech ready? Are the presentations ready? Okay, thank you. So before we go into our next agenda item, I'll turn to Parliamentarian Johnson so that we can reestablish a quorum.
Yes, Madam Chair, I will begin with the roll call calling your name. Chair Moore,
Present.
Vice Chair Brown,
Present.
Member Bradford,
Here.
Member Grills,
Present.
Member Holder,
Here.
See, we're the here
Member
crowd.
Jones Sawyer,
Here.
Member Lewis, Member Montgomery Stepp,
Here.
Member Tamaki.
Here.
See, now everybody gonna start fighting, you know?
Madam Chair, there are 9 task force members, and the number needed for a quorum is 5. The number present is 9. Madam Chair, a quorum has been reestablished.
Thank you. Now that a quorum has been reestablished, we'll now turn to our next agenda item, which is agenda item number 7, discussion and potential action items, scope of work and outline of contents of Report 2, facilitated by Member Lewis and myself as the Economic Advisory Committee, but it will be led by these esteemed economists that we see before us right now, Professor Casey Campbell and Dr. William Spriggs. Thank you.
Just tap it one time. Tap it lightly. It's on.
Thank you. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a privilege to be here to kind of give this presentation on a very important topic. The expert group, which includes myself, William Spriggs, Thomas Kramer, Kirsten Mullin, and William Sandy Darity, have worked on collaborating with the advisory group at the request of the task force to come up with an appropriate framework to start the discussion on the calculations associated with reparations and compensation. And what we want to present today is a bit of a roadmap of what exactly the expert group has been working on, and to provide different elements of the calculations associated with specific dollar amounts in some cases that are rough estimates, and also to provide a kind of wish list associated with data that we might need as we refine and continue to calculate these different numbers. So firstly, we wanted to start off by saying when we approach this as a group, we look specifically at 2 frameworks or models that we could go through. And these 2 frameworks or models were vetted, and we went through the process here with the task force of allowing us to figure out which particular method we should continue to calculate and use as a compensatory framework for reparations. So I wanted to kind of go through those right now. The first model that we started really digging into, and is our primary model, is the harms or atrocity model, is what we're referring to it as. The second model, which we'll talk about very briefly today also, is the national reparation model, because it will provide some framework for the task force to think about other elements associated with the extractive institution of slavery. So just some very important framing questions that we had that we wanted to bring up at the forefront that we thought about before we started calculating was we needed to be very clear on what exactly are the damage time frames. And this becomes very important when we start to prioritize Black descendants of persons enslaved in the United States. And we'll ask the task force for leadership and feedback associated with these timeframes as we present the calculations. Another element, framing question that we had that we think is very important also is what will a California residency requirement look like and how it will be determined. Again, we're looking to the task force for leadership associated with that, since it can in fact affect some of our calculations And even though we have rough estimates today, as you give us feedback, the process is one that will continue to be refined. We also have, in some cases, we have presented as best as possible good years for the beginning of a harm or atrocity, but that is also dialogue that we'll get from the task force and direction as we start to look at these different categories of harm. Finally, one other framing question that we had is how exactly reparations will be paid and measured, and we will provide a sort of roadmap to calculating some of these. But as I said earlier, we will need data and some help as we try to get, cleaner numbers as we progress. So I'll dig firstly into probably the model that has been co-signed by all of the expert team, I should say, and has our full support in terms of an appropriate framework to calculate reparations or compensation, and this is the harms or atrocity calculation model. So to begin, the group has identified 5 harms or atrocities. And I think at the last meeting, as we brainstormed together with the task force, there were 13, including an other category. So as the expert group has looked at data, as we have looked at appropriate mechanisms for calculating harms or atrocities, the 5 groups that I'm going to present is what we have now, given the amount of data that we have available. This is not to say other atrocities or harms are not important if you don't hear them here. And this is also not to say that this list is exhaustive. As soon or if we get better data or more recent data, then we can in fact go through the process of figuring out what these look like. So I'll identify the 5 areas and give you an idea of what we have come up with in terms of calculations. So the 5 areas we have pinpointed is firstly, unjust property takings by eminent domain. And we'll highlight what we've been thinking about and data requirements as we progress. The other category that we will and want to be able to quantify explicitly, especially in the first round, is the devaluation of Black businesses. A very important category, and we do have some rough estimates on this, will be housing discrimination and houselessness as an appropriate category for reparations and compensation of damages. We will also be looking at the disproportionate Black mass incarceration and over-policing, and we do have rough estimates associated with what reparations and compensation should look like. Finally, we have operationalized and calculated a harm or atrocity category in the form of health harms that will show you what we have thought about, and we also do have rough estimates associated with that. So our process has been, one, a lot of feedback with the task force and the advisory group. So we want to be able to select the appropriate atrocities that we can calculate. We want to provide an appropriate time frame, given that this task force has a date to publish this report. So we want to make sure we have provide a period of suggestion to the for time frame. There are some data requests from the DOJ that we have listed here that we will require to refine our numbers. We will quantify the harms within the range that have been identified. Some we already have rough estimates. And of course, the framework is one based on feedback and approval from the task force as we present these different steps as we go through. So I'm gonna move forward to the next page to kind of give you an idea of what we have been doing and calculations we've been doing for each atrocity that I just identified. And the first one I want to start with is the concept of unjust property takings. And the expert group has taken some time to figure out how best can we provide a quantitative measure associated with this. And one of the things that we started to look at is when we get a sense of how exactly individuals settled in California and the unjust movements of those settlements of Black communities, we wanted to be able to identify specifically what these particular activities were. Was it a convention center? We have examples like Bruce's Beach for, we want to be able to get as much as possible an exhaustive list of these different types of activities that took place in California that displaced Black communities. And once we get a sense of that, because we don't have a rough estimate for this, because there's some data requirements, once we get a rough sense of that in terms of where people move from and where they move to, we can look at differences overall in the value associated with the from and the to. And in most cases with these unjust property takings, the from, the particular area that Black communities were uprooted from and dragged from, is in fact worth more than where they are or where they were relocated. And that difference is in fact a damage. And that's what we want to be able to identify. So we do need, to even begin this process, we have a general idea associated with how exactly we're going to look at these different property takings, but we have some data requirements that we have listed here to give us a more refined number. I could go through some of them fairly quickly. We want to be able to identify market prices for properties that are associated with unjust property takings. We need to be able to identify equity value of Black and white homes in California, because again, that difference allows for us to calculate harms. We also identified that there were some, it might not be a transfer from residential to residential, but there might be big, like a community, a convention center, or LAX, or the county museum that display, or a freeway that displays Black communities. So we wanted to have an idea of who lost their property and what were they paid for their property, so that we can get a sense of today, what exactly is that loss associated with that movement. Same thing with the bridges, transportation networks, water systems. So the list is quite expansive when we talk about unjust property takings. It's not just residential damages or residential movements in terms of what we were seeking to calculate. You want to expand on? Okay. Now, the second atrocity that we really need to delve into is the devaluation of Black businesses. And one way we wanted to operationalize that was through lost profits. When we look at differences overall in the startup of capital for Black businesses, in the operation of Black businesses, in the customer base, or how exactly revenue is earned in Black businesses, this is significantly suppressed. And we wanted to be able to get a sense of the damages associated with this. We don't have rough estimate yet, because again, we do need some data to be able to figure out what exactly this will look like. And it will differ from sector to sector. So the tech sector will be very different from apparel or any other sort of different business sector. So we wanted to be able to disaggregate this by sector as much as possible. So again, we have a list to help us to start the calculations or the data requirement for rough estimates of the valuation of Black businesses, which is an important aspect of calculating compensatory damages and reparations in this framework. Now I'll move to the other category that we have done quite a bit of work on and do have rough estimates on, and I'll outline our methodology. And this is the atrocity or harm that's labeled as housing discrimination and houselessness. We did quite a bit of work on this particular category and identified a time frame that we thought was suitable to capture these losses. So the time frame identified was 1933 to 1977. And this time frame is not to say this is where losses stop, but it's the time frame to allow us to calculate the particular harm or atrocity that's tied to especially housing discrimination. We still have some more work to do on houselessness, but housing discrimination we have some rough estimates on. And this is what we did in a nutshell without going into the weeds. We pretty much tried to figure out what was the disparity that existed in the house value for whites versus black in California. So the median or average house value in California, we established that in 1930. And just to give some context, from our calculations, we saw black California households, the amount of total wealth held in homes in 1930 was about $42 million. Compared to white wealth in homes, it was sitting at about $8 billion. When we look at this huge disparity in something as important, an important asset such as a home that accumulates over time, when we look at a starting point that is lower, that is depressed for black individuals, over time you can imagine the disparity that exists. And this is why this particular harm, it's not the most egregious, but in terms of being able to really identify something quantitative in terms of house values, really gives a bit of context to the appropriateness of reparations. That's 1930, we wanted to get an idea of the gap that's associated between 1930 and 1977 so that we could capture redlining activities that have a huge impact on housing value. So we captured again this total home wealth gap in 1980. And the disparity that we have there is for black home wealth in 1980, we're looking at about $39 billion in California compared to white California homeowners' wealth sitting at about $715 billion. So it's not surprising that the gap widened. But again, the nature of that total home wealth gap is something that needs to be addressed in terms of reparation. An asset over time continues to accumulate value. And if it is the case that you start off with a lower amount and over time, it doesn't matter in terms of the catch-up. It has to be the sense of something happens in terms of a direct action to cause that catch-up when it comes to closing that home wealth gap between blacks and white in California. So with that said, and using that disparity that existed, we came up with a methodology that allowed us to figure out, as a rough estimate, that what is appropriate, given the time period that we have identified, is that each would receive $223,239, or about $5,000 for each year between 1935 and 1977 that's spent as a resident of the state. This is to capture the housing discrimination and that disparity that exists in the housing value that I just explained just now. So we do have a rough estimate, and of course, the process of quantifying and operationalizing this and figuring out how exactly this ties into the bigger framework of reparations is something that the task force will continue to deliberate. But we wanted to provide our framework for housing discrimination and give you an idea of where the estimates are so far with the data that we have. As I said before, for each of these are rough estimates. We still need more data. We still need help in terms of getting this data, and we have data requirements that we have outlined in each of these atrocities or harms that we have calculated so that we can continue our process of calculating the compensatory damages associated with the reparations process. Now, another area that we took some time to calculate and figure out, another harm or atrocity that has even been mentioned today and in the past is this disproportionate black mass incarceration and over-policing. This is a big issue in California, and what we see is an explosion of the prison population in the United States, and we identified a particular period that allowed us to quantify as much as possible the amount of compensatory damages associated with this particular harm or atrocity. And we picked the period called the War on Drugs because it's a seminal period associated with huge disparities that exist between black and white arrest rates in the United States and in California. And what we see is an overrepresentation of the black community in prisons, especially for how we have operationalized this for the war on drugs when compared to other races. So what we have done is we have looked specifically at how exactly, or if an individual is imprisoned, or more appropriately, as a race in terms of black people being over-incarcerated, what is the appropriate amount to take into consideration over that time period that we have an overabundance of black Californians in prison associated with drug arrest? And with that time period, we associated a wage rate. So if you are wrongly locked up or you're in prison or there's an overrepresentation of the black population in prison in California, there are losses associated with not being able to earn on the labor market. That's the way we quantify this. So we found an appropriate average wage rate, and how we looked at it is we said a person being in prison because of overrepresentation of the black community being arrested on drug charges, it is similar to being an unpaid forced state employee. So you have been held by the state against your will, and the appropriate wage that we should attach to that we found in terms of the calculation would be, what do state workers earn on average? Since it is you are an unpaid state worker, is how we kind of operationalize this. And with that, we were able to come up with an estimate associated with this mass incarceration disparity. We also included a value for loss of freedom. That's a rough estimate. And the amount that we came up with was roughly $171,000 per year of disproportionate incarceration in 2021 dollars. So using that methodology of an overrepresentation of the black community in prison or arrested for drug offenses, the annual salary associated with being a forced unpaid state worker was about $171,000 for the harm or atrocity associated with this category. So I'll move on to the final atrocity or harm that we identified, which was the health harms. And we kind of took the approach from a disease management perspective. So black individuals in the United States and in California are sicker and have died younger than white people. So when I say from a disease management perspective, incidences of certain diseases such as diabetes, high blood pressure, and the list goes on, erodes the value of life for black individuals. So how we operationalize that is to look specifically at life expectancy gap that exists between blacks and white in California. And what we see is we have a life expectancy gap in California between black and white of about 7.6 years, meaning white individuals live 7.6 years longer on average than black individuals. So with that value of life that we have at about, it's called the value of statistical life of about 10 million, we were able to use this life expectancy gap to come up with an appropriate health harms calculation or loss, which sits at about $127,000 per year of life expectancy that's associated with the health harms calculations that we have. So I've kind of gone through the 5 health harms that we have identified so far, giving you an idea of the methodology we have used in each of these categories. And where we have rough estimates, I've provided those. We did also want to talk very briefly about the national reparation model, which is very different from the harms or atrocity model. And the idea behind this is to look specifically at the wealth gap in the United States specifically, to kind of get a sense of the wealth gap that exists between black and white. It is approximated at about $358,000 when we look at the wealth gap between these two groups. So if that was to be operationalized, and again, this is nationally, so it is not specific to California. How exactly this gets divvied up in California is not something or a methodology that the expert group is able to provide any expertise on. But if it was the case where we look just at the proportion of the population in California, we're looking at a conservative estimate of about $636 billion for reparations collectively, if we were to just use the share of the population. Again, how that is divvied up or the process to kind of get that segregated is not something the expert group can provide, since it is not specific to California. One final thing that I wanted to say, or that the group wanted to bring up, was based on some of the feedback from the task force, there seems to be an interest in understanding some sort of hybrid framework. Because I said earlier, we started out with 13 atrocities or harms, and from our calculations we have, or from what we're able to calculate right now with the data we have 5 harms that we have calculated. So the process of quantifying those other harms or having some sense of redress with other harms that are not identified or explicitly calculated by the group, we wanted to talk very briefly about some sense of a hybrid framework where there are very specific harms or atrocities that are calculated, just like what we did with the 5, but the national model or reparation models, again, how that is divvied up or the proportion of federal reparations that California wants to undertake is not something that we can advise the task force on. But we wanted you to be aware there's this sense of these are the specific harms associated with California. This expert group has calculated 5 categories of that. But there's also a federal reparations model or framework that sits there. And the process of will California take hold of some of that federal reparations, whatever it look like, or if they decide to do that, that would allow for some sort of hybrid framework. The logistics of that and how that will be done is something the task force will have to kind of figure out how to operationalize. And yeah, that was where we were in terms of our scope of work and what we have been working on and what we have done so far. I don't know if any of the other experts want to chime in.
I'm studying their text to us. They are joining us virtually. Just to be clear, our attempt to look at the business model is, sorry, I turned it towards that. The business model is very different than what's in the federal model. And this is related very much to differences that the state itself has done when it comes to contracting. So there are some specific harms that get to a sense of corporate wealth, which is not really a part of the federal model at all. But it's vital when you think about the harm done, when you think about institution, when you think about the power that comes from who gets to hire and who doesn't get to hire. When you think about business, please remember most business is business to business. It's not commercial. Most business is somebody supplying somebody else with what you get as the small value added as a customer. The discrimination when the state engages in discriminating in contracting bleeds over into the inability to do that business to business as well. This is different than what's in that federal model. So I just think that's important to draw the distinction of what we're trying to do and to get at a sense of why the harms model, being very specific to California, is different. And in terms of what the two legislative members have brought up, this gets to you going to the California legislature about the specific acts that California did and the harms that California did.
Sorry? Professor Darity and Kristen Mullen or Professor Kramer, do you all have any additional comments?
No. Glad to hear from the task force, any questions that they might have.
Okay, great. Okay, so I think to recap, thank you all again for such a thorough presentation. I was just joking earlier, I think after this process is over, we need to get you all a Nobel Peace Prize in economics. This is great. So just to recap, because it's a lot of information to kind of internalize, Member Javon Lewis, did you want to speak right now? Okay. I just wanted to recap for folks. So over this past summer, since we met in April, this esteemed economist team has been working hard in gathering whatever data is readily available to essentially help crunch the numbers for what monetary compensation, reparations can look like in the form of monetary compensation for particular state-sanctioned atrocities. And so at our April meeting, we tasked the economists with doing the following. One, telling us what a national reparations framework might look like. And based on the advice and counsel of Dr. William Darity and Kristen Mullen, we learned through this process, right, that technically, right, the state of California does not have the budget to pay what is really owed in terms of monetary compensation for reparations for the institution of slavery. Dr. Darity, since you're here, can you just briefly explain, right, why the state of California does not have the budget for this, for the national framework?
Well, it's also going to be an interesting question as to whether or not the state of California has the budget for the itemized harms-based framework. Mm-hmm. But with respect to the national framework, the premise is that the federal government would be responsible for eliminating the racial wealth gap. And so in parallel fashion, we could do an estimate of how much it would cost the state of California to eliminate the black-white wealth gap for its black residents who are eligible for reparations. And we estimated, I think at some point, that a rough figure for the requirement for doing that would be in the vicinity of $650 to $700 billion. And in contrast, the state of California's total annual budget is actually less than $300 billion. And so it would be a very tricky proposition for the state to make a commitment to eliminate the racial wealth gap for its black residents who are descendants of American slaves.
Okay, thank you. So if folks didn't hear Dr. Jarrett in the back, essentially he stated that in order to close the racial wealth gap, right, the federal government would have to pay the descendants of American slaves up to or over $700 billion, from $650 to $700 billion.
The federal government would have to pay $14 trillion at least,
14.
but the
It's only
state of
California.
California, for its own residents who are eligible for it.
Right, okay, thank you for that clarification.
650, 700 billion.
So the bill for the federal government, in order to close the racial wealth gap on the federal level nationally, would take $14 trillion. California, in order to pay its debt entirely, would be $650 to $700 billion, but you have to mirror that with the fact that the yearly budget for California is only $3 billion a year.
300.
$300 billion a year.
$300 billion.
Yeah.
But the other issue was a conceptual issue. Because the other issue is a conceptual issue. The federal is an average amount, and it refers only to the personal wealth gap. So there are two different things here. One is, this is an average, and just as people were making comments about someone moving, this incorporates the movement of African Americans, some out of states that had slavery and worse records, to some who moved to states where they thought there was more opportunity. This is an average amount. To disaggregate would require trying to figure out what's the net amount, given that California certainly discriminated less than Mississippi. So what do you do to figure out California's part in something where there's moving parts? When you have the federal, we're not worried about people moving to opportunity. We're just saying on net, this is what it is. And so conceptually, to disentangle that, given many people moved to California to escape worse opportunities, some people left California because California had its own problems. It's not possible under that federal model to do that calculation that says this is the part that is California's, other than to make some claim, well, it's just the average, and so that it's a conceptual difficulty. So for us to give you a number based on that model, it's too difficult for us to disentangle.
Thank you.
And this harms model, by looking at business wealth, is looking at a corporate debt, which isn't in the individual wealth model, only to the extent that somebody has the corporation closely held and it's their own. But it doesn't let you look at corporate wealth.
Can I say something briefly just about this whole question of, who is receiving these funds? I was recently doing some research on the life and the achievements of Queen Mother Audrey Moore, and she commented on the fact that in the 1920s, this is after she and her family had heard Marcus Garvey give a speech in New Orleans. They thought, we need to move, we need to leave Louisiana. And initially they thought they were going to move to the continent. But then they decided instead that they would go to California. And, but they moved, so they decided to visit California for about a month, thinking this was the land of milk and honey. And she talks about how they met, these black women from quote unquote black society, but went to Santa Monica, went to several different cities. And what they encountered was the same kind of racism that they experienced in New Orleans. She said, they wanted to sell us a 5-cent soda for $5, and then we couldn't even drink it there. And when people heard me say, where is the freedom that we heard about was here for black people? They said, oh no, you need to go to Chicago. That's where our people are free. And so she and her family then went to Chicago to take a look. and she was talking about, all these sort of mean, impoverished districts that Black people had been pushed into in Chicago. And she thought things were worse in Chicago than they had it in New Orleans. And they said, oh, no, 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 not Chicago. The place you need to go is New York. And so off they go to Harlem, where in fact, Jim Crow, Black people were not even allowed to be employed as drivers of streetcars or buses. It was just an abomination. But ultimately they said, well, we have to put our roots down somewhere. And so they stayed. But the point is that, this is what justifies federal reparations, because there's no place across the country where Black Americans were allowed to have full citizenship rights.
Thank you. And so for the benefit of the public, I was just summarizing what we've worked on over the past few months. So again, prior to our April meeting, the task force had already opted out of the national model. And so we decided to go with the state-sanctioned harm model. So in April, we discussed 13 potential harms that this task force could recommend monetary compensation for. Over this past summer, the economists worked with what was given by the task force, and for now, reduced the harm from 13 to 5 based on the readily available data that currently exists. But then that's another question I have to ask you all in terms of any potential action items for the subpoena advisory committee or the task force as a whole as to how to get the data that you all need to continue to crunch the numbers. But again, just to summarize what Professor Casey Campbell already articulated, there are 5 named state-sanctioned atrocities that the economists have already started to crunch what actual compensation could look like. So for instance, atrocity number 1, unjust property takings, right? They just stated that there's still some data that is needed to get those calculations. But generally speaking, the way to approach the calculation for compensation for unjust property takings, as Professor Casey Campbell said, was to examine the market value at the time of the property was taken, determine the amount that was paid to the owner as just compensation, subtract that figure from the value of the property and increase the net value of the property by adding in a fair measure of the estimated appreciation to the present day, or in the alternative, use the current value of the property as a measure of compensation due. But again, there is some data gaps present that we potentially need to fill. The second atrocity that Professor Casey has already articulated, that there is already some data for, is the de-evaluation of Black businesses. So again, as Professor Casey Campbell stated, there's a basic formula to ascertain what compensation might look like for the de-evaluation of Black businesses, which would be based on lost profits. Lost revenues minus avoided costs equals a net lost profits. But again, there's still some data that they need to crunch what that actual figure might look like. And they pointed out to, for instance, disaggregated data amongst sectors and industries. The third atrocity that they have identified over this past summer is housing discrimination and houselessness. So this is one of the atrocities where they've already come up with a potential figure for what monetary compensation might look like. So if 2,550,000 Black Californian residents who lived in the state in 2021 were descendants of the enslaved in the United States and had spent their entire time period from 1933 to 1977 in California, or were the legal heir of a person that did, each would receive an award of $223,239 or $5,074 for each year between 1933 and 1977 spent as a resident of the state. Heirs not residing in California could file claims independently of this harms identification program, and members of other groups could file their claims later. So the fourth atrocity, they've already started to crunch the numbers for what actual monetary compensation could look like, is disproportionate Black incarceration and over-policing. And through their work, they found that the total average compensation would be $170,657 per year of disproportionate incarceration in 2021 dollars. And as Professor Casey Campbell stated, that would be based in part on the lost ability to participate in the labor market, loss of freedom, also based in part on what a state employee would make, because if you were unjustly incarcerated through the war on drugs, you were technically a forced laborer. And then finally, the fifth harm, as Professor Casey Campbell articulated, is around health harms, right? And it was in the calculation that they've already come up with is the following: $966,921 is the health harm estimate for Black descendants of slavery who spent all of their lives in California. So that would mean that Black descendants of slavery would be allocated $127,226 for each year spent in California due to the health harms that plague the community. And that's supported by data, as Professor Casey Campbell already stated, that Black Americans on average die younger and are sicker than white Americans actually since the inception of this country. And that's also in our report. So I just wanted to give us a quick summary. Again, we've already opted out of the national model. We've adopted the state-sanctioned harms model, where the economists are starting to crunch numbers for what compensation will look like for particular state or California state-sanctioned atrocities against the African American community. With the data that's already available, they've been able to crunch the numbers for 3 atrocities thus far, but there's still some data that is needed for the other 2, and then also for the 3 that they've already done some calculations for. I wanted to end my comments by asking if you all can briefly talk about the hybrid model, because I know someone shouted out, you can put down a down payment. So I know the hybrid model is the idea that California acknowledges that they don't have the budget as compared to the federal government, but in recognition or in order to pressure the federal government, there could be a potential that California could make a down payment on what the federal government owes. So if you could maybe explain that, and then I'll turn it to Member Jovan Scott Lewis and task force members if there's any other questions or comments.
What we have for the hybrid model in terms of what it looks like, we actually don't have a recommendation. But the basic structure is in the state-specific harms or atrocities that have been identified. Once those are quantified and calculated, it may very well be the case that there are other categories that were not captured or not quantified. And a way to kind of get some estimate or sense of redress for these other categories might be the task force could consider that what California's share of the federal reparations, if they would take a portion of it to kind of close that gap on the other categories. So why we call it a hybrid model is because the harms or atrocities have been identified, but to fill the gaps associated with maybe other atrocities, maybe other areas that were hard to quantify, it could be the case that the task force considers some sort of taking on the burden of federal reparations, a portion of it, and what that looks like, how much it is, if they can do that, what it means if at some stage in the future the federal government does decide to do reparations, if California took a portion of it, is it still owed? All of those mechanics we don't have the expertise to advise you on.
Thank you. Member Jovan Scott Lewis. Oh, can we get his mic to work? It's not working. His is not working.
Can we try? There we go.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you to the economic experts team for all the work. And yeah, we could work on that Nobel Prize for sure. So Professor Spriggs, the question of residency seems to be the linchpin of the issue here. Cutting across all of these various atrocities, it seems as if, in addition to more data, what you also need is a decision from us as to what are the terms of a further refinement of the eligibility question that lands specifically or squarely on the matter of residency. And so I want to kind of take that opportunity to, come to my colleagues here on the panel to kind of maybe see if we can entertain some kind of discussion around that. I recall this question being posed to Secretary Weber during her visit several months ago, and I think it was left relatively open. Whomever is a resident is a resident. And I do think, given the fact that we've had multiple conversations, in our subcommittee meetings, that we do need to provide you with some better parameters that I think the residency question can hopefully provide. So I don't know, are we allowed to open up some kind of discussion around the question of what we think about the terms of residency? So that way we can actually provide the economic experts team with better parameters for how they can go about identifying the terms of these atrocities. Because I imagine if you're looking at, say, the whole periods or the redlining period from 1930 to 77, you may want to say, we may have to create some kind of instrument whereby someone would be able to, or would be required to prove, that they were resident in the state at that time. So I would love for, my colleagues and I to have that discussion if we have time. Chair Moore.
So we are having a discussion around what potential requirements would be around residency. I guess my first question or comment that I had is based on reviewing the materials from The Economist, kind of the residency requirements are kind of baked in to some of the calculations. So for instance, housing discrimination, you would be eligible for that $223,000 total if you were a California resident from 1933 to 1977, or $5,000 for each year you are a resident of the state. So what do you think about that? Is that an example of the requirement?
I mean, I think that is certainly a framework, but the point is that we haven't provided any formal guidance. And so, we're putting the burden on the economics experts team to make these decisions, and they shouldn't be burdened with those decisions.
Does anyone have any comments? As you stated, we've kind of approached this conversation some months ago. I know Secretary Weber, through her expert testimony, someone asked her, what did she think the requirements for residency should be? And she said, if you're a current resident of California, you should be eligible, but that doesn't necessarily get to what we need to get to. So does anyone have any thoughts about that? Yeah, Member Grills, you're
I
recognized.
have a question about this. I raised, the last time we discussed this, I raised the question, before we go out and reinvent the wheel, what has already been established around residency requirements for California for different things, for tax purposes, for tuition credits, et cetera. And so I was wondering whether or not the expert panel had an opportunity, or if DOJ or anyone has had an opportunity to look into what are the established criteria for different issues related to residency.
No, we have not. With the calculations, it's either the time period, as Chair Moore identified, or we use Black residents in California as the maximum. So that residency requirement does in fact allow us to put parameters on the overall damage categories, but we have not explored, the concepts that you just identified.
And again, it gets to two different issues, right? Are you asking that in terms of, was I a resident in 1935? Or are you asking that with reference to, do I get to make a claim? So if you're asking it in terms of, today, I hear about this and I go to file my claim, am I a resident of California? So that's one question. The other question is, what do I need, what's the definition that I was a resident from 33 to 77? What is the test for my grandmother moved here in 1933 and my family has been here since then? That's kind of two different questions.
I guess for me, I was thinking if we established a criteria based on our best thinking and someone wanted to challenge what we had come up with, and they could point to, well, why didn't you refer to other criteria for residency? And so this is by no means an exhaustive, search on this, but one of the things that I found out in terms of establishing residency in California is that you have to have a driver's license within 10 days of coming here, voted in a California election, filed for a homeowner's property tax exemption, et cetera. The question of whether or not, we want to ignore those things and try to make a case for establishing residency in relationship to the harms, I get a little stuck because it's almost like I'm not finished understanding the final set of harm categories and how much harm does one need to have, endured in order to be considered qualified. So I'll take myself as an example. So what would you do with me? I'm from South Carolina. I came here in 1980 to go to graduate school. I have never left. I've owned homes, I've voted, my children are all born here. But, in terms of my ancestry and my earlier part of my life, all of that is the South and the East Coast. So would you consider me a resident, or would it just be my children born here? Or would it be that if I was here, once I was here 3 years and established residency for graduate school tuition reduction, that I become a resident? There's just, I go into this cycle and I can't find my way out.
Please.
That's crazy.
Please. I'm sorry about that. Member Grills, were you finished?
Yes.
Okay. All right.
Madam Chair. Yes, just 1 minute, everybody. Remember what Aretha said, R-E-S-P-E-C-T? We say she's a soul sister, and we want everyone to please respect this audience. But we listen to you now. We had speaking time. We had time for you to speak. Sir, we're not going to volleyball back and forth.
All right. So we're going to move on. So did you have a question for them, or you just had general comments?
Well, yeah, it was just trying to understand how we begin to think about the residency.
All right. Excuse me, sir. You can share your public comment tomorrow from 9 to 10 a.m. You'll have 3 minutes to do so. I ask you to respect the space and be quiet at this time and allow us to conduct our business. Thank you. All right. I think that And this is something that we'll discuss tomorrow as we plan out what our future hearings will look like. Member Jovan Scott Lewis and I are on another committee that's tasked with planning that out. So, and it's in the meeting materials. For instance, we're proposing that we have 2 additional hearings where we're going to focus primarily on the area of compensation. And so I think part and parcel of that, of those meetings will be us figuring out, I think, the definitions of residency. So I wanted to ask Member Jovan Scott Lewis, do you think that we should come up with a decision on that today? Because if so, I do have a potential solution. I think that, in my personal opinion, and this is based on the work that that the economists have done, I think we can agree to a general principle, but if there's any disagreement, I welcome that as well. That for any of the 5 atrocities that we've named thus far, you're eligible if you, of course, meet the community of eligibility standards that we determined in February in terms of lineage. But then also the second principle that would guide who would be eligible is if you were simply a resident of California when that particular harm took place, and the heirs of that person, or if that person left California after the harm, they could still be eligible because they were residents when the harm took place. That's just kind of how I see it, but I welcome any thoughts around that.
Madam Chair, members of the task force, I would like to suggest that we have a committee who would consult with the experts and come back with a well-thought-out position on this matter. Yes, I move.
So to be clear, okay, so it has been properly moved and then properly seconded by Member Reggie Jones Sawyer, and it was moved by Vice Chair Brown, that the committee that already exists, so the Economic Advisory Committee, which comprises of myself and Member Jovan Scott Lewis, will just go back and work with the economic consultants to present some potential definitions for residency and requirements for residency. Okay. Is there any discussion on the matter? Okay, hearing no further discussion, we'll
Sorry,
turn to...
Chair Moore. I would just encourage other members of the task force then to communicate through the DOJ to Camila and myself what some of your thoughts might be. So as we go away and deliberate with the economic experts team, we can have your views in mind.
Hearing no further discussion, I'll turn to Parliamentarian Johnson for a roll call vote.
With Chair Moore,
Aye.
Vice Chair Brown,
Aye.
Member Bradford.
Aye.
Member Bradford votes aye. Member Holder. Aye. I'm sorry. Aye. Member Holder votes aye. Member Jones Sawyer.
Aye.
Member Jones Sawyer votes aye. Member Lewis.
Aye.
Member Lewis votes aye. Member Montgomery Stepp.
Aye.
Member Montgomery Stepp votes aye. Member Tamaki.
Aye.
Member Tamaki votes aye. Madam
forgot me.
Chair,
You forgot me.
Ms.
Oh.
Grills. Dr. Grills.
I apologize. Member Grills.
That's okay. Aye.
Member Grills votes aye. Madam Chair, 9 members were present and voting. There were 9 ayes and 0 nays.
Thank you, Parliamentarian Johnson. There were 9 ayes, 0 nays, and so the ayes have it, and the motion carries. Member Jovan Scott Lewis and I will continue to work with the economic consultant team to devise potential definitions for residency and the requirements therein. I want to go back to the economists to see if there's any other information that you all need from us in potential action at this time.
We didn't discuss, but eventually, when you propose the way that you would want the reparations to be paid, that we will be working on trying to give you cost to see whether your proposal would reflect the cost that we come up with. So we just want to be clear about that.
I didn't hear you, I'm sorry.
Depending upon how you propose that the reparations be paid, that we understand part of our task would be to give you estimates to align what you're proposing to what we are proposing as the cost. So as an example, if you said you wanted to do something like a part of the national, given that there's no way that the state of California has the money in a year, if you said the state of California henceforth will grant free tuition or whatever, for us to give you an estimate, this is our estimate of how much that has as a value. That's how it lines up with what the amount is. We understand that's part of our task. So we understand that's the next part of what we would have to get to you. When you get to the part where you're telling us, okay, we agree with your estimates and your approach, now we're going to tell you how we propose to fulfill it.
Thank you.
And as it concerns data requirements, in the document, we have a very specific list. And it says data requirements, and we even shaded it blue with bullet points. So those would definitely help with the refining of the estimates that we have.
Okay, so before we move on, because our next meeting might not be until November, so I don't want anything to get lost in translation or communication. So there's already, you all have already identified data that is needed. And so my question is the DOJ helping with that, or do we need to have a conversation about how we could use our subpoena powers for that? Is this the time to talk about that?
Chair Moore, if I may. I don't know if you want to respond and then I respond.
No, please, go ahead.
Okay. So Chair Moore, we have been working through this plan with the advisory committee experts, and essentially the way this will work, for lack of a better process, given the advisory committee and the meeting schedules, is the task force is going to sort of give directions like you're going through and talking through right now. The advisory committee is going to translate that into a series of questions and asks that'll come through the Department of Justice and the expert teams. The expert teams will do research collectively, DOJ and the experts will do research, try to figure out answers to the questions, working with the expert team to develop sort of a response, whether that's an amount of money or we can't figure out that amount, or here are some ways to do that. And then, like they've done today, present information and options to the task force to then vote on. Because this second part of the report, we'll talk about this a little more, is really task force driven. You all are making every decision from here on out. You're looking to the experts for essentially the evidence, and we'll work with them to develop that evidence. But the point is making sure you all have every piece of information and data and the substance behind any decision you would take, and then you all take that decision, and then we will then, following that, work with the task force to prepare how it will look in the second report. Do you have any questions about that process that I can help clarify?
I think we just want to make sure that the experts team is able to get from you what they need. And so I think that was really the crux of Chair Moore's question. And so is that the case? I don't know. I think we don't know. There's information that they're asking for specifically, and I think we just want to make sure that they have the ability to get that information so that we as the subcommittee can then, convey what we think needs to be done, and then we can communicate with the task force about, decision making thereafter. So do you have, has there been a request? I'm going to ask directly. Have you requested the information that you needed? And have you received an answer?
Not any formal request, just in the form of, this is the data we require and here is the list, but we have not formalized anything. So
Okay.
there needs to be a conversation on what that process is with the DOJ.
And so, Michael, can they ask the DOJ directly for that information, or
Oh,
do you come into that?
absolutely.
Okay.
No, we're working directly with them, that we have the relationship with them as well, and I don't want to sell them short. The work product that they put together has been through their research and their work
Oh
in
yeah, we
developing.
can tell. I just want to
Yeah.
make sure that they have. In
But
other words,
we
I don't want to have to
stand by.
keep playing a game of telephone that they have to tell us and then we tell you, and then I just want to make sure that they have what they need when they need it.
And are you like insinuating there needs to be a motion to, is that what you're saying?
Absolutely, no, not, absolutely not necessary. So we will be working directly with the experts. You all are giving us direction collectively, us and the experts. We'll be working directly with the experts. There's a fluid, behind the scenes, there's a fluid conversation between us and the experts. Any requests for information that they might have, we will, as we did in the first report, obviously use, every avenue available to us, whether it's the state archivist, the state library, our own DOJ attorneys doing research, or if we need to do additional contracts or find other people who can provide data. Subpoenas, as we've talked about, probably in terms of the timing is not the ideal, especially June 30th, 2023, is not an ideal vehicle to try to get information, but we'll report back on a continuous basis if we're having a hard time getting data. I'm sure you'll hear that from the experts as well if they need data and for whatever reason we're not able to get it. But we'll bring the full force of the office to get this data.
I have a comment similar to this. I've been working on a state project on mental health disparities, and one of the members of my research team is an economist. And we have found that it takes 3 times as long to access what you would think would be simple administrative data. And so I don't know, I don't have your list, but do you anticipate any potential challenges with some of the data, types of data and data sources that could present a challenge to this very tight timeline that we're on?
It's conceivable. You had the earlier discussion about the state of data that the counties have on race for prosecutions. And it's conceivable that while the data may exist, it may take time because it wasn't already gathered in a readily accessible way. It may take time to actually produce the data. So that's conceivable for some of the things we want, specifically when it comes to the unjust takings. Because in the case of the unjust takings, many of those would predate computerized records. Some may have been since computerized, but there may be issues that it's not currently easily accessible.
That was exactly what I was thinking, that if you take one community, let's say the Fillmore that Dr. Brown is so studied in, where 20,000 people were displaced, 900 black businesses destroyed, happening in the 50s, to get that data and know where those 20,000 people are. I mean, at the time, obviously they were residents, but once they lost their home, they may well have left. So there's an intersectionality that we'll have to deal with there, but just tracking the value of what was paid out in the eminent domain, take the money, here's all you're gonna get, and we're gonna evict you. It could take a very long time to track down that data. So I think our timeline is what it is. I mean, we have to come up with the recommendations by 2023, period. And so to the extent that the data cannot be retrieved within the usable time frame, then the task force may have to pivot and come up with a more generalized way of forming the repair, it seems to me. Otherwise, we're going to get mired in trying to get, for instance, the city of San Francisco to go through archives and documents and try to find stuff that's not computerized. So I think we ought not to underestimate the daunting nature of that. That's not to say we don't do it, but I think we just need good communications as to what actually is doable. I'm sure the Department of Justice, after talking with experts, there's people, like researchers that have already gone into, redlining on this that may have exhausted, maybe they would know the state of being able to get this data on eminent domain, for instance. But I think we need a candid early on assessment of how long this is going to take.
And I think that's a very good point, which is there may be, data gaps where the data just doesn't exist. We will, like I said, do everything we can to get data from every possible resource, but there may be areas where there are data gaps, and so we'll have to talk about, ways of estimating or even guesstimating, and in that kind of situation, the experts may present a couple of different options to the task force, and the task force will then have the responsibility of selecting among those options which way they would want to go, and based on the data, it would be very clear what that's based on. I think, to my earlier point, some of that is going to involve both choosing between a number of different options, but also there are a number of questions, as the experts have laid out, that will need to be answered by the task force, sort of not only one time, but on a rolling basis, as it becomes more clear from the experts what they're able to provide. It's going to be a very back and forth process.
Yeah, I just have a quick point of clarification. So as I'm looking at this blue highlighted section, and I noticed that most of the data that you're requiring or that you're missing and that you need is quantitative data, numbers, stats. Some of it, though, to a limited degree, is qualitative. So like you have a question like, younger and younger black people are being incarcerated. What is this history and how many have been imprisoned? There's a piece of that that's qualitative that seems to require some qualitative analysis from subject matter experts. So I'm wondering if you can sort of isolate what is qualitative and give us an idea of how you would like us to get you that qualitative information. Do you want us to have subject matter experts to talk to you about those pieces, or,
I don't think there's a lot of qualitative data. I don't know if Kirsten or Sandy wants to elaborate on some of that with the qualitative. The quantitative, as you said, is just there and it's just what's needed. But qualitative, I'm not sure if the angle of experts provide, again, given the timeline, or I think a lot of it too is really getting direction from the task force, because given the nature of qualitative data that can have different angles, we want the task force to make the decision associated with whatever it is that we choose, that this is what they want, or this is what they want to see. So I think, as Michael was saying earlier, a lot of it is back and forth communication, and you giving us a sense of, this is it, that makes sense, so that we can move forward rather than have these different alternatives that might exist.
okay.
Okay. Oh, sorry. Professor Kirsten Mullen, you're recognized.
Thank you.
Please, members of the public, be quiet, and you can give your public comment tomorrow, 3 minutes long, 9 to 10 a.m. Thank you. Kirsten Mullen.
Thank you. I just wanted to say that, one way that the qualitative data, one way that the quantitative, one way that the qualitative data can be incorporated is to, provide a space It could be a website, a repository for individuals to share their stories for posterity. One of the things that the task force has commented on is the lack of places and spaces in the state of California where those stories have been welcomed and collected. So we definitely want to keep, to collect those stories and to preserve them. But that's not the kind of information that we need to generate these calculations.
Okay, are there any other comments? Okay, so members Jovan Scott Lewis and I will be working with you all over the next month or so and getting, make sure you get the data that you need. So thank you, Professor Spriggs and Professor Campbell for showing up in person. Thank you, Professor Darity. Oh, Member Gross, you're recognized.
I'm sorry, and I just had a question for clarification, and I also just wanted to thank the expert panel for the extensive work you've done so far. It's appreciated. I was just wanting to ask a question about the list of the 5 harms atrocities. And I understand that the subcommittee worked with you to reduce down our list to those 5. And I was wondering if there was any particular reason why education was not included on the list. And in particular, when you look at education, you start stepping into the territory of lost lifetime earnings, housing implications, health implications, and it's, there's all kinds of data sources that can be done, and there are some studies out there that look at the economic impact of learning loss. So I was just wondering if there was a particular reason it wasn't included.
There's the list dwindling down has to do with just data that's available and what we thought we could calculate in a robust fashion that could stand up to scrutiny, especially from an economic perspective. And these were the 5 that we initially identified. They're no way exhaustive. It could be the case where with more data or an appropriate model or specification, we could extend that list, but there's no specific reason or no reason why we chose these 5 except just data and a methodology that we felt would be robust to start with, just the availability of data.
Chair Moore.
Yes.
If I could just ask a question. I want to make sure, because I noticed there's a timeline referenced in your presentation, and I want to make sure that for next steps that we understand what is needed so that we can navigate how we may need to structure things going forward, making sure that the task force is able to provide answers to some of the framing questions that you've identified, for whatever it is that you need for the next step of your work. If you can identify that so that we can make sure that we lay out whatever we need to, if there for whatever reason needs to be a meeting called where the only thing on the agenda at this point is to address some of these things that might take place before a larger meeting such as this, where we take on a lot of other business that the task force has to take on. So I just wanted to make sure that we can identify that so we can make plans going forward.
The biggest requirement would be the data required for calculations. As much as possible, if we can tackle that list, could start off with the easiest. So we probably will have to meet to start off with what can we gather almost immediately and things that might take a longer time or a longer process. But the first and foremost thing is the data required for calculations that we identified.
Thank you again, Dr. Spriggs and Professor Campbell. Thank you again, Professor Darity and Kristen Mullen. And thank you, Professor Kramer. Our condolences to your mother and safe travels from Germany back to the States. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. So it is now 2:36. Our break period was from 2:15 to 2:30, so we're past our break time. So I wanted to ask the task force members, do you all want to take a 15-minute break now or go through the agenda, power through the agenda? Okay, we'll take a 15-minute break, and we'll get back at 3 o'clock. Let's just do